we've talked about natural selection, let's talk a little bit about evolution. So we haven't defined evolution up to this point because I really wanted you to understand the mechanism that is behind evolution. So if we take a look at the definition, evolution is a change in allele frequency from one generation to the next. So if we remember back to genetics, alleles are different versions of genes. So we're really talking about the differences in different traits that are changed over time. So this only applies to populations. Individuals cannot change alleles. So an entire population over time needs to adapt to an environment. So some factors that produce variation, we're going to talk about a few of them, and the first one is artificial selection. So we've been artificially selecting different kinds of traits in dogs, for example, in plants for many, many years, ever since we started domesticating dogs and agriculture came about. So artificial selection is the process of intentionally or sometimes unintentionally modifying a species through our own actions, through human actions. And this encourages the breeding of desirable traits over others. So this example of dogs, we really like our working dogs or our toy dogs or any type of dogs where we desire certain traits. But this also can happen unintentionally. Let's say, for example, in fishing, we tend to want the biggest fish. So over time, we've taken the biggest fish out of the reproductive pool. So our fish have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller in the oceans. So what we knew, almost 100 years ago is not what we're actually fishing for now. We're fishing for much smaller fish. So variation can be produced by artificial selection. Variation can also be produced by mutations, and we've talked about mutations in other videos. Mutations occur in gametes in order to have evolutionary significance. So when we're talking about mutations, we're talking about these when they happen in meiosis. A DNA change might happen in these gametes themselves. This is where we tend to have the mutations. So mutations are principal sources of new variation. And they can occur rapidly if mutations are coupled with natural selection. So if there is something, let's say a mutation for us to have a sixth finger, and we have an entire population that has 6 fingers, somehow we find this to be advantageous for the population, then it's quite possible that humans in the near future could have 6 fingers. So it really is all about the rapid expansion of these mutations if natural selection gets involved. Another factor that could produce variation is gene flow. And gene flow is just the exchange of genes between populations. So we tend to have high population mobility in some areas. That means that it's going to increase the gene flow. So way back in the day when we didn't, or we weren't able to transport ourselves very far, we didn't really have airplanes, we didn't have a whole lot of cars, places that were across the country were very, very far to get. So we tended to stay in our own little communities, and we found mates within our own community. However, now that we are able to go to different countries and we can go on a whim whenever we want to, there has been a large exchange of genes between different countries and different populations of humans. So this means that we actually have reduced speciation, but we have increased our genetic variation. So we only have one species of humans, and that's because we are constantly exchanging genes back and forth. Another factor that can produce variation in a population is genetic drift. Now, there's 2 examples of genetic drift that we'll talk about. But genetic drift is caused by random alteration of allele frequencies in a population, and it's typically tied to population size. So small populations tend to have greater genetic drift possibilities. This first example that we see here, this is called the founder effect. And this is when a small founding population will colonize a new area, and with it, it's going to carry some of the unique characteristics about that population. And it's amplified because that population is very small. So in this particular example, we have ladybugs that are both yellow and red, and we have a member of the red population going on to an island, let's say. So it's going to colonize a new area. Now, if you notice on the island, there's only red ladybugs, and that's because that's the only gene that happens to be there. The yellow gene is not found on this island. So over time, it might be possible that this small group of ladybugs could perhaps become a different species for other reasons, but this is the founder effect. No yellow ladybug is found here because of that unique characteristic of the red color of those ladybugs. Another example of genetic drift is the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect is when a large population is reduced rapidly due to some factor, such as war or famine, disease. And that small population of genetic variation will survive. Now, again, I have the same red and yellow ladybug populations here. But for whatever reason, we have a lot of the red ones dying out, but all of the yellow ones died out. So we've reduced the genetic variation within this ladybug population. And now what we have is just red ladybugs because the yellow ones got completely wiped out, along with some of the other red ones as well. So due to whatever happened here, famine, disease, war, only a small number of these ladybugs, the red ones, have been carried forward. So only those traits are being carried forward. So we now again have a small portion of genes or a small genetic variation in this population. Another factor that produces variation is genetic recombination. And we've talked a lot about this when we talked about meiosis, how we have these particular genes swapping, basically. So they swap chromosomes. It's the same gene, they just happen to swap chromosomes. So that whole thing about crossing over and then independent assortment in meiosis, what's happening here is that we're getting a reshuffling of these genes. So it's not necessarily causing evolution themselves, it's just providing a new source of variation. So we have these new combination of genes, and then that will be carried forward perhaps. And again, if it's advantageous, perhaps we'll see that in later populations. Now, we talked a little bit about natural selection in a previous video, but natural selection can also act on variation in a population. We see two types of variation. We always see inherited variation, and that's the type that we see that's inherited from the parents. So from the parent population, the eye color, skin color, hair color, in flowers, the petal color, size, things like that. But we also see environmental variation. And now these are characteristics that might be affected by factors in the environment itself, such as climate or diet. Perhaps accidents could provide this, lifestyle or culture. These are things that actually do have some sort of that act on variation. And again, over time, if it happens to be a little advantageous, then it's going to stick in the population. The example we have here, these are hydrangeas. And if we put hydrangeas into different pH soil, what happens is we get a different flower color. So the most like the neutral pH down here at 7, we're going to get a nice vivid pink color hydrangea. But if we have more acidic soil, it's going to be a bluish hydrangea. So you can always tell the type of pH of the soil by planting hydrangeas, basically. Now, natural selection can also act on the variations that we talked about, so mutations and gene flow. And if natural selection actually acts on these particular types of variation, then it's going to happen really, really fast. And an example right here is the wild mustard plant. So we have bred, as humans, we've artificially selected for certain traits in the wild mustard plant that have led to broccoli, that have led to cauliflower or kale. Natural selection has also acted on here and has done really rapidly. These particular plants have evolved into something that we know today. So the wild mustard plant is actually the beginnings of a lot of the food choices that we eat, a lot of the greens like kale, cabbage, broccoli. And those are the things that were favorable for those environments, and they happen to succeed. So natural selection will carry on the successful traits. An example of this, besides just our wild mustard plant, is a gene for sickle cell anemia. So in and itself, sickle cell anemia is a harmful mutation in a population. It's very rare in most human populations because it's a fatal condition. So if somebody has sickle cell anemia, it's a very fatal disease. Not always now, there's lots of treatments, but there's a large population that typically it can be fatal for. Now, there's a geographical correlation between the frequency of this particular gene, the HBS gene, and where malaria happens to be. So if you take a look at this this picture on the left, this is a map of Africa where we see a higher incidence of sickle cell anemia. But if you notice this map on the right, this is where we see tons of malaria as well. Now, if you notice, there's this correlation between the two here. And what we've found, or what scientists have found, is that heterozygotes for the HBS gene, meaning somebody who has the condition or might carry it, it actually provides a natural resistance to malaria. So those people that have both a gene for sickle cell and maybe a normal gene, these people have greater reproductive success because they're resistant to malaria. So this is something that is definitely something to watch. So natural selection has acted upon that particular gene itself and carries that forward. That's a greater reproductive success for those people that have that particular condition. Even though it is a fatal condition, it actually is beneficial. It's a natural resistance to malaria. Now, we see sometimes natural selection observed in modern times, and actually we can see this within a generation or two. So one example of this is industrial melanism, where I mentioned, I believe in an earlier video, where we have peppered moths. And in the Industrial Revolution back in England during that time, we had normal trees kind of look like this. They were peppered. They were a little bit more white due to lichens or some of the other things that grew on trees. And these peppered moths blended in really well. Notice you can't really see this peppered moth that's circled here. But during the Industrial Revolution, we had the trees becoming a lot more sooted. They had a lot more black tint to them because of the soot that was in the air. So notice that white peppered moth, or the lighter colored moth, is now very prevalent against the black background. But if you notice, the darker colored one, that is camouflaged really well. So during this time, we saw an incidence where the lighter moths became less, the darker moths, the populations became more because of this phenomenon. So this is something that we've actually observed during modern times and within a few generations of humans as well. Another example are the Darwin's finches, of course, and I've mentioned these in several videos. And the thicker-beaked individuals have better reproductive success during times of drought because they're able to find those harder seeds. So we can take a look at the wheel here and kind of see what it is that these particular finches are eating. But during drought conditions, the birds that are able to open up the harder seeds, those are the ones that tend to survive a little bit longer. And of course, we also see antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria and other microorganisms within days. I mean, this is something that we can see within a few weeks. So if we have, let's say, we have a normal bacteria here, but we also have a mutant here. If we apply some antibiotic to this, notice that the normal bacteria has died. But if there's a mutant one that's resistant to the antibiotic, it's going to survive, and it's going to carry forward its reproductive success. It's going to carry forward that gene for antibiotic resistance. And this continues to happen to this day. This is why we start to see we have a lot higher incidence of MRSA and some of those resistant strains of bacteria to antibiotics. It's becoming a problem. Now, these and other examples of evolution show certain common principles. There are 3 common principles that we have here. The first one is that a trait must be inherited to have importance in natural selection. It is not something that's acquired during a lifetime, but it must be inherited. Number 2, natural selection cannot occur without variation in inherited characteristics. So genetic variation is what natural selection actually acts upon. Without that variation, it cannot act. And number 3, fitness is a relative measure that changes with changing environments. So due to whatever happens to be the trait that is easily adaptable, environmental conditions do play a role in this. So natural selection plays a role. Also, environmental conditions can play a role in this as well. We see this a lot of times in the sexual selection in a peacock, and I know we're not able to see this video in my video, but I do recommend taking a look and seeing that the peacocks that tend to have the greatest color, the males are the ones that have the greatest color, they're the ones that actually are able to have greater success in reproduction because they're prettier and they're the ones that have the greatest traits. Sometimes the drabber ones, the ones with less color, are not ones to carry forth their genes because of the sexual selection of those females. And finally, let's review everything that we just talked about. So, reviewing these genetic factors. At the molecular level, mutations in the DNA are transferred to the gametes. If then we have these mutations carried to the chromosomes, then we might see some evolution or genetic factors and evolution happening at the chromosomal level. At the cellular level, the chromosomes then pass the mutations to offspring. Organisms, those individuals, that particular trait is subject to natural selection. So it's all about reproductive success. Now at populations, the population undergoes evolution when allele frequencies change. So it all starts with the molecular level all the way up to populations. So remember, individuals do not evolve, populations do. And things do not change overnight. It is a gradual change in order for some sort of reproductive success. So natural selection can act upon traits to make something a little bit more favorable, which will be carried on from generation to generation.